Hello there and welcome to this tutorial on creating a mana bar in the Blender game engine. Now I know there are certainly many tutorials on creating energy and mana bars, so I will quickly only show you the basic mechanics and then we'll take a look at some more advanced things for the visuals, so we'll take a look at some script that can enhance the visuals of your mana bar. For this tutorial you're going to need the latest version of Blender and GIMP. The first thing I'd like to show you, which is very important for importing images to the Blender game engine, is the Import Images as Planes plugin. Now why is it so important? Because when you import images with this plugin, the ratio of the image is actually already correct, so the image has the right ratio when getting imported, and thus shows the biggest quality when you view it in the viewport. Now since mid mapping can't be disabled for single objects in the Blender game engine, it's very important to get the highest quality out of these images. And so it's important to get this ratio right, and you get the perfect ratio using this plugin. Alright, so I've created some basic GUI button for this mana bar in GIMP. Now it doesn't really matter if you also have something created. You can also just use the basic plane in a greenish color or a bluish color, or you just quickly go to GIMP and draw in some gradients to get a basic GUI button. Now since this is a BGE tutorial, I won't elaborate further on how to create these buttons. If you're interested in tutorials on GUI button creation, just leave me a comment so I know that I can also do some tutorials on 2D stuff, but obviously only if people are interested in that. The next thing I'll do is duplicate this basic mana plane, as we will now create an overlay plane that will hide our plane and kind of work as the representation of the amount of mana we still have. So instead of just creating a new plane, I use this one to have the scale already and shrink it down a bit so it fits the borders I've created on the other image. It is important to apply the scale of this object by hitting Ctrl and A and then clicking scale, so that when we scale it for transformation and animation, it doesn't kind of reset itself if we scale it differently. Also make sure to make the material a single user by hitting U and Materials, so that we don't change the image of the original plane that we copied from as well when changing this one right now. Now as you can see, I'm loading in a flat image that's only 1 pixel wide, but on its length it has information about the shadow, and that gets spread over the plane so that you can fill a whole plane with just a 1 pixel wide image. In one of my other videos I've said that the rule of the power of 2 is important for game assets. In this case I've only used this kind of weird scale of the image to save some time. If I would use this in a real environment, I would create a texture atlas, so a 1024 by 1024 image, on which I'll add all my buttons and so on, and then use the UV layout of the single buttons to match it to the right position of the image. Alright, so now I moved the plane in edit mode, so that the origin aligns with one side of the plane, so that I can actually scale it only to one axis. Then I moved the whole thing to the left, rotated it, and moved it so it aligns with this HUD again. Alright, so now we can animate it. At frame 0, I inserted a keyframe for the scale of this object, so that the whole scaling gets added to an animation. Then I went to frame 100 and scaled it down so that only the minimum of this plane is visible at frame 100, and inserted another keyframe for the scale. If you now hit Alt A for the animation to play, you can see that this actually looks like the mana bar increases right now. And that's the effect we want to use for the game engine later. Alright, so up to this point it's about the same tutorial about mana bars and energy bars as any other game engine tutorial on this topic as well. But now we'll change something up and add an additional kind of visual effect, which is a basic line that kind of indicates the point where the mana bar is currently at, and that can be found in a lot of games. I got especially inspired by Diablo 3. I don't play that game myself, but I've searched a bit in the internet and found this blog here, which I already knew of. And this guy makes amazing posts about kind of game hacks, workarounds, game mechanics that are used to increase the visuals and so on. And he wrote an article about the orbs in Diablo 3 and how they use the blend modes to kind of get this basic line, this line that indicates where the mana is currently at. And we'll kind of recreate that effect right now in the Blender game engine. For that purpose, I'll show you how to create this line in GIMP, which is basically just creating a basic square or rectangle of white on the black texture, then using the smudge tool and smudge it a bit to the left and right, and overlaying it again so that you have a straight line. After you've smudged it, create a new layer of white and smudge that one a little less, so you have a straight line which kind of looks a little smudged at the sides. Now this obviously depends on what style you want to go for. You could also create a straight line with a gradient to one side and so on. So you have to decide what design you want to go for, as this is not really a design tutorial. Now we'll take the plane and import it into the Blender game engine and set the alpha mode to add, and obviously make the plane shadeless. Make sure to move this line over the other two. Now you can create the animation for this line as well. It works the same way. At frame 0 it's on the far left, and now we won't work with scaling but with location. So at frame 100 you can move it to the right side and insert a keyframe for location. Now since the center curves work like it starts slow, gets faster and gets slower again, we need to change the way the curves are working, and therefore go to the IPO curve editor, hit V and select vector so that we get a linear animation. Do this for both objects, the overlay plane and the indicator line, so that both animations will play exactly at the same time. Now we want to go to the logic editor and assign a property to an action so that we can set an integer to control how far the action is playing. So we can say if the value is 50, the bar is filled to the half, and if the value is 100, the bar is full. So we want to create a property, an integer, which we will call mana or life or whatever you create, and set it to 0. And we want to create an action actuator that's connected to an always sensor, and that's set to true level triggering, so it's always triggering this action actuator. And on the action actuator, set the play mode to property and select our mana property. Now we can define how far the action plays with the frames that are given to the integer. So if the integer is 0, the current frame of the action is 0. And if the integer is 50, the current frame is 50. With that you can create great amount of GUI stuff, as you can animate anything and then put it into integers, and these integers can easily be manipulated. Now make sure to select the right action. If you have no clue what your action is called, it's usually the same name as the object plus some action addition. You can go to the dope sheet and then select the action editor to rename those actions so you find them easier. Now I quickly set up some logic that increases the value of this property by 1 every 0 logic tick, so always. And this way we can actually see this animation working. Now the only issue is that if we add values to properties this way, they will go to infinity if we don't limit them. For that reason I'll create an expression controller and say if mana is still under 100, it can increase by 1. If it's already 100, it will stop. Now in order to have the exact same behavior on this indicator line, I will just copy the property mana of this overlay bar to the indicator line, so it will always follow the same property value. This can easily be done with the property actuator set to copy. Now this will only work for objects in the same scene, and as we later want this HUD to be on a different layer as we want to overlay it, we will need some sort of script that will allow us to copy the properties of an object to the HUD. But for now this property copy actuator is enough. Just make sure to select true level triggering when copying properties so it gets updated every logic tick and not just once at the start. Alright, so the next thing we want to take a look at is the script I've just mentioned. How do we now copy properties from an object to an overlay scene? For that purpose, I'll just quickly create a scene which I will overlay this HUD on. Now make sure if you have an overlay scene with an HUD that you actually set the camera to autographic and move it up a bit so it renders out everything that's in the viewport. Since we've keyframed the scale of this overlay plane, we can't rescale it to now fit the screen space that we wanted to assign it to. For that reason, we will actually scale the camera and move it around. Now I want this cube to be the object that has the mana property and that the HUD gets the mana property from. So there is something added to the game engine already that lets you send properties to other objects, but there was never something implemented that lets you read it out without Python scripts. So for now we will set up the logic that lets you send this property to our HUD. For that, just add a message actuator and message to our HUD object that it should copy the property, and the subject is kind of the keyword, the same as the subject in an email, so it's actually able to read it out. So we want the HUD to receive this property right now, so we set up the basic logic to receive a message, and it's supposed to assign this message to the property. But as I've said, Blender's game engine is not able to read out this message without an additional script. So in the video description you can find a link to this thread on blenderartist.org, which was created by Professor Monster, and he provides us with a script which contains lots and lots of stuff and useful things for the Blender game engine, but we will only need one of those things, and that's the sensor to actuator module. To actually get this blend file and copy out the Python scripts, you need an account on blenderartist.org. Now once you've got that blend file, the latest version, copy out the s2a.py and insert it into a new Python script in our blend file, which you'll also call s2a.py. Then add a Python controller to the message receiving object, so in this case the HUD, and set it to module, and type in s2a.firstBody2Value. This will now allow us to read out the message and assign the property of the cube to the property that we've set up on this HUD. Now since this indication line copies the property of the HUD, both will now work with the value we give to the cube on the actual gaming scene. So this way you can create a basic mana bar that gets its value from an object in the game and is still on the overlay scene so that it doesn't interfere with anything in the game world and you don't actually have to render it out in front of the camera of the main gaming scene. Lastly, I want to show you how I've created these animated bubbles in my mana bar demo in the update video. And therefore we're going to need another script as well as two basic images. Now first off, let me show you how to create these images. You need to go to GIMP or any other photo editing software. Apply a jitter to your basic brush. Should be a hard brush, you could also use smooth particles, whatever suits you. And set the scaling to random. Sometimes you should also increase the spacing of the brush so you don't get too many dots on the same place. Now this texture will also work as an addition texture, just like this indication line, and we will animate the UVs so that it moves upwards, downwards, or any direction you like. Keep in mind that since it's moving, it should be tileable, so don't draw any of these dots on these seams so that they don't kind of get cut off and you have cut particles in your texture, so you don't see when it repeats. Now I've created two different versions of this so that it gives some fake feeling of depth on this mana bar, and I just imported them again with import images as planes and overlaid them over the basic layer of the HUD. Now to create some fake depth, I've created two different images and I will overlay them with a little bit of space between them. And I will actually move them at different speeds so it looks like there is some depth inside that mana bar. Now in the description you will find another link to yet again a blend file on blenderartist.com, which has a script inside that we can use to animate UVs. Now you can use this for anything you like. As seen in my update video, I've used a tileable texture to kind of fake movement. So basically you can create anything that tiles and it should be moving, so something like a conveyor belt for example. Now we'll just copy that script out of the blend file, add it to our blend file on a new text document, and then set up the logic so that it always gets triggered on true level triggering. Now we also need two properties, set to float, one x and one y, which represent the axis on which you can scroll it. Now keep these values fairly simple, so 0.003 to 0.001, something like that. Now you can decide on which axis you want to move your texture, and it will actually just move and tile again and again. As you can see in my overview video on UV unwrapping, this will move onto the other spaces of the UV coordinates, and so tile and tile again, and yeah, just create this fake impression of movement. So as I've said, I've applied two different speeds on these two planes, so they actually look like they are in depth and some bubbles are behind and moving slower. Alright, so special thanks go to Professor Monster and HG1 for first of all obviously creating these scripts, than letting us use them. And thanks especially from me for allowing me to use them in this tutorial and present them here. Alright, so this was a very quick tutorial on creating this mana bar. As I've said, this was more about these scripts, and since we're going to reuse them probably from time to time, I wanted to introduce them in the context of something, and so I created this mana bar. I hope it wasn't too quick. If you have any questions, any ideas on how to use it elsewhere, any ideas on tutorials, just leave me a comment and I'll take a look at it. Thanks for watching.